Hi guys, in this video we'll be looking at acapellas and some of the tricks that you can do with them to make a more interesting mashup. We'll look at using chops and loops, as well as some of the effects that you can put over them to make them interesting. Then we'll look into extra drum loops and see how they can help you fill in the energy gaps in your projects. First up, let's look at a mashup we were using previously, which simply consists of a main track and an acapella. So far, we've looked at using reverse reverbs to help an element come in, but there's a lot more that we can do with this acapella. Let's have a look. Eight or 16 bars after the main track kicks in, it might be nice to start using a chopped up version of the vocal element as a bit of a lead in to the break. This serves two purposes. It reminds the listener that there's an acapella in the song, and it also allows us an extra element to build energy with. Here we'll make a small modification to it to make it more interesting. Now we'll put it on another track so that we can apply more processing to it in other sections. Since it's been used to lead into the breakdown, it might be good to have it in the first 8 bars of the breakdown, just subtly filtering off as a lead into the full vocal. We can also use delay send automation, reverb automation to help it blend or to fade away gradually. Combined with a reverse reverb, it blends into the verse nicely. We've had to extend the breakdown by 8 bars in order to allow for the vocal arrangement. So we simply use the same trick that we use when extending intros or outros, a careful crossfade across an 8-bar section. Let's say that we wanted to take 8 bars out of the acapella and move the chorus to be 8 earlier. Let's also say that upon listening to the last 8 bars, we decided that having the full vocal chorus over the build was too busy. We might decide to remove 8 bars of the verse so that the chorus can come in 8 bars earlier. Then we can perform a loop on the very last word to have it continue all the way through the final build. This is a very common technique in dance music, whether we're talking about mashups or just regular tracks. So listeners are used to hearing this kind of looping. Still, if you can get it as smooth as possible so that it simply sounds like the vocalist has sung one long note, that's even better. there's more that we can do to it. We can put additional effects or even filtering over the looping vocal if we want. A great effect that Live has built in is Frequency Shifter. It has a coarse and a fine frequency adjuster. And if you automate the fine control, you can get some pretty great results in the last 8 of a breakdown. Just remember that if you need to pull the pitch back down in order to get one final repetition of the vocal out, automating the pitch back down is going to sound pretty strange. So it's usually better to leave the pitch setting up high and simply automate the wet-dry control to make a quick fade to dry. If you want to get really tricky with your vocal chops, you can make some pretty interesting loops, particularly in the intro and the outro of the main track, where there's a lot more room. Whatever chopping you try and do, try to give it some real personality and make it its own instrument. Pay attention to the rhythm of the element behind it, and try and make sure that it works with it rather than against it. When we extended our breakdown by 8 bars to accommodate for the vocal, it meant that there's a longer section now where there isn't a step up in energy. If you find one of these moments in your mashup, you might find that you have to add your own element in order to give the listener the step up in energy that they're expecting. A couple of great elements for this include clap loops or ride loops. If we listen to the track, we can hear that there's already a clap going almost all the way through the breakdown, but there isn't a ride cymbal in there, so we can import one. If we pop one in there just as the chorus is coming in, it gives it a subtle lift in energy. The great thing about a ride cymbal hitting on every beat is that it doesn't detract from the rhythm by trying to change it. It simply adds a little bit of intensity. Just make sure you gradually get rid of it before the main track kicks back in. When going through the steps of setting up a samples folder earlier on in the video series, we talked specifically about making a folder for snare builds. This is because this is one of the most important elements you'll need. For a moment, let's pretend that the track we're using as our breakdown track doesn't actually have any kind of specific build. To emulate this, I'll simply repeat 8 bars of the breakdown. Here's what it sounds like. Without a snare build in there, it's difficult for the mashup to get back to the main track. You'll come across this problem a lot when using pop or rock tracks that aren't built in that standard dance format. You'll also run into this problem when the two elements that you're blending together happen to both use moving chord progressions that don't sit on the same notes during the build, meaning that you can't transition smoothly between them. You're only able to let one of them play at a time. In cases like these, you need to get a snare build from somewhere else. Let's have a look at another section in our main track and see if we can find a single snare to use. With a little cleaning up, this snare sample should be able to be copied out into a snare build pattern. Use any fading or EQ that you need to tidy up the drum hits. To perform short fades on clips, Rather than using the track's volume automation, you can go over to the automation dropdown and select fades. This allows you to place a fade in or a fade out on a clip. Coupled with some filtering, this can make quite usable snare builds. The advantage to doing it this way is that you're using a sample from the main track, which means that the sonic flavour and energy of the snare build will match the rest of the mashup. The downside is that you need to be able to find the right drum, and that you need to be quite creative in making a pattern for it. There just isn't time to create a build for every mashup that doesn't already have an easily accessible one. That's why it's useful to have pre-made snare builds sitting around in a sample folder. If you can find a snare build that has a reasonably similar energy, it can still sound at home with the mashup. Just remember that different styles use different sounds. If you need to warp your samples to keep them in time, be very careful what type of warp mode you use. If the BPM of the original sample is different from the session tempo, you'll want to use beats mode, set to a beat interval that doesn't chop its way through the middle of a drum sample. You may even want to start it off on 1/4 and increase it to 16ths as it goes. You can also use a reverse reverb like we looked at in a previous video in order to help the main track come back in. This can work well when combined with a snare build. Additionally, when it comes to grabbing individual drums, loops, or entire 8-bar sections to help your mashup progress, a great place to look is always the intro and the outro. Often the intro has great builds without any melodic elements playing over them, and the outros have long, steady drum sections without any effects playing behind them. The more that you can borrow from the elements that you're actually using, the more your mashup will sound like one united piece of music. Next, we'll do a special video on one of the hardest things to do in mashups, dealing with massive tempo changes. These tempo changes can be quite tricky and often use almost all of the techniques that you've seen so far just to make them work. So if you're ready for the challenge, I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.